The story of the prodigal son. Luke 15:12 through 23. A certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of thy goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his wealth. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country, and then wasted his substance with riotous living. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent them to the fields to feed swine. And he would rarely fill his belly, and husk that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. And when he came to himself, he said, How many hired servants has my father? Gave bread, and had enough to spare, and I perish with hunger. I will arise, and go to my father, and will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven, and before thee, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But when he was a great way off, his father saw him, and had compassion, and ran, and fell on his neck, and kissed him. And the son said unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven, and in thy sight, and am no longer worthy to be called thy son. But the father said to his servants, Bring forth the best robe, and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand, and shoes on his feet. And bring hither the fatted calf, and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. My father gave this gospel a few weeks ago, and I hit the realization that it perfectly encapsulated the position we are now in as an American society, and what we need to actually do as conservatives, as individuals, and as a conservative movement to move us through the 21st century and hopefully restore what we once had as America. What is going on, guys? It's Jonathan Drager. This one, we're talking about the prodigal son. We've got the white monster represent. And we're going to be putting the story into normal speak, and then hopefully showing how it can be a representation of what conservatives can do, what we can do as individuals to restore what we once had and make America great. So let's put the story in normal talk really quickly. The story goes, the son demands his inheritance from his father, which obviously a lot of people don't even have an inheritance from their father. But the son does. And he then takes this inheritance and spends it lavishly. Obviously, he's young and brash and probably pretty liberal, let's be honest. So he spends most of it on riotous living and drugs and alcohol and probably prostitutes. Everything that really young people will spend their money on these days, maybe some nice cars. So then he realizes that he has no money and the area goes into a famine. And it's not really clear whether the area goes into a famine because he spent his money. Probably not, but there's at least that correlational relationship between he spent all his money on riotous living, on useless living, on the short here and now, and then the area goes into a famine. And after that, he has to become a servant, and not even a servant, a slave, and only is able to eat the husks that the swine leave over for him after he feeds the swine. After that, he realizes, as the son, that his father has servants, and that if he went and served his father as a servant, that he would probably have enough to eat, as that area was not in famine, and that instead of living as a slave because of his riotous living, he could live as a servant to his father, in back where he was. And then, as he comes home, his father sees him and gives him a robe, and gives him a nice meal, and forgives him for his trespasses against his father, and for spending the inheritance from his father. Finally, if you read the rest of the story, there's about another 10 verses about his brother getting jealous, but I don't think that once you understand my interpretation that it'll have as much relevance to this version and this view of looking at it. So, my understanding of the story starts off specifically for Americans and Americans in the 21st century is that we need to understand the father in the story as the wisdom that God gave the American civilization over the last 200 years. And then that the son is actually us as Americans and us as conservatives. The father gave us this inheritance, this amazing society that we really inherited in the 1950s and have since squandered. And that amazingness of our society really became decadence over the last 70 years since World War II. And we have squandered everything. We have wasted everything on sex and the liberalization of marriage, like I articulated in the last video. We have gotten rid of our manufacturing. We have gotten rid of everything that the Father actually used to create our society, to create the wealth like was in the story. And the Son, which is us as Americans, took that inheritance and threw it away on decadent living. Because of this, we have actually become slaves. And I think this is a very important note to talk about. Jocko Willink, someone that I really admire and I really think is one of the best people that can advise our civilization and advise people on how to live their lives, has really two main concepts that we'll talk about this video, one now and one later. The first one is discipline equals freedom, and the second one is extreme ownership. And discipline equals freedom, the one that I'll talk about now, is really shown in its ultimate form here, but the opposite. So because the Son gives himself to his desires, gives himself to riotous living, he becomes a slave because he had no discipline. He had no discipline to do any work. He had no discipline to follow anything his father recommended. He instead just spent all his inheritance on riotous living, the opposite of discipline. Because of this, he has actually become a slave. And we experience this too. Whether that's people succumbing to their vices through addicted to pornography, them being addicted to drugs, fast food, or anything else. People have become a slave to themselves, and unlike this story where he's a slave to someone else, people in the 21st century are really slaves to their own desires, which isn't even much better because everybody is their own master, and the master, we can't get rid of the master and everybody without a huge cultural shift. And there's even another level to the story because he voluntarily becomes a slave. He obviously, he wouldn't do it if he had money, but he didn't. He voluntarily became a slave so that he could get food. He wasn't one day grabbed by a henchman and shipped to some big factory where he was forced to be a slave. He voluntarily offered himself up to be a slave. And that's really, really what position we are in right now. People want to become slaves. This is people saying pornography is good for you. Fast food. People don't say fast food is good for you, but they excuse it. They say that you shouldn't be fat phobic. And you shouldn't make fun of people because of something they struggle with, but you shouldn't be proud of something that everybody knows isn't a healthy thing. And this is the situation that we're in more and more, where it's not even we don't want to become slaves, but people are actively encouraging others to become slaves, actively encouraging people to become addicted to pornography or to become fatter. They want them to be addicted to their vices. I don't know if there's some one world government that's trying to make people lazy. There probably is. But it's really people wanting to become addicted themselves because they think it'll make them happier, but they really just become a slave to themselves without any discipline. So then when he becomes a slave, he only has the leftovers of what the pigs are going to eat. And this is obviously important because pigs, especially at that time, they were super unclean. You couldn't eat them. Everybody knows Leviticus or you couldn't eat them easily because they were unclean, because they created bad meat that was often dangerous to eat. When someone succumbs to their vices, they become more unclean, they become uglier, they become fatter. Everything that makes people more swine-like, more pig-like, they become lower than what they were before. And this isn't some condemnation of everybody, because everybody struggles. But becoming a slave purposely to what you know is bad really hurt the Son in the story, and is also hurting us as a society even more than becoming slaves on accident. We're really doing it on purpose and trying to not discipline ourselves because it won't make us happy. However, the Son does not get stuck as a slave. He has one huge realization that could make the United States, if we all had this realization, the best society for the next 2,000 years, at least I think. And that's, instead of being a slave to yourself or to somebody else, you should be a servant to the Father. And that's a huge switch. Because a slave to yourself, it's wanting to do what you want, succumbing yourself to your own desires. But being a servant to the Father, well, that's a totally different thing. That's giving yourself up for somebody else, for something else, something bigger than yourself. following the things that you know you need to do, doing the things that are hard but necessary for both your children, your family, like we talked about in the marriage video, giving yourself up for your spouse, like we talked about in the economy video, creating one society, sacrificing the now for the future. And I really think that's where conservatives, you can be atheist and conservative, but I don't really know how. I don't know how you justify it in your head, because as conservatives, we believe that we should sacrifice now for the future so that we can conserve now for our children, for our grandchildren. We can conserve our society for the future generations. And I don't really know how you can justify this as an atheist if you think it's all just atoms. I mean, I guess you can care about your children. You can care about what's happening next. You think it might be interesting if your name is on a building or something in the future. I don't know. I don't really understand how atheists do this. But Christians, we have the call to serve our Father, which is serving God. And we know that when we serve our Father, that's actually turning away from the destruction and hell that becoming a slave to our own desires and a slave to others really leads to. So Jonathan, what does this have to do with conservatism? What can we do as conservatives to embody this story, embody the Son, so we can return to our Father as we see the slave? So Jonathan, what is the actual things that we can do as conservatives to head down a path that serves the Father instead of becoming a slave to ourselves? Well, like it says is in the story, is we have to return to the Father and return to what our forefathers did and return to what God gives us as wisdom, to stop becoming slaves to ourselves and to go down a road where we have success and we have an American civilization that we can be proud of. Thankfully, it's not the most difficult thing to become successful and to not be a slave to yourself in normal life. Ben Shapiro, if you listened to him a couple years ago, I don't know if he says it now, but he says that poverty really shouldn't be as much of a problem in our country as it is, because as long as you graduate high school, have a full-time job, and don't have children out of wedlock, in 10 years, I think 95% of people get out of poverty, something like that. However, if you indulge yourself in every sensual and every sexual and every food and earthly desire, you won't actually have that same successful life. I think we as people in the 21st century need to humble ourselves in saying, hey, the people that lived 70 years ago, they actually had the right idea. Get married, get a job in manufacturing, get a working job with your hands, have children, come home, live a good life. They weren't actually as dumb as we thought they were. They weren't backwards thinking about sexuality, and they didn't have the wrong idea about a whole bunch of things that we now think they were wrong, but obviously they weren't perfect. But we need to understand that they actually had some really practical wisdom that we just ignored because we think we're so much better with our science and new understandings that actually might just be hurting us as society and making us slaves to ourselves. So thankfully, the story also has a good ending, because the son won't be perfect. He won't perfectly serve his father, but the father sees him off in the distance trying to come back to him. And he brings him a robe and he brings him sandals and says, we'll have a great feast. And this means that we as people won't have to be perfect in restoring what made our society successful, but we just need to take steps in that direction. And if we take steps in that direction, hopefully we'll start progressing in the way that we know we should, making more jobs, creating a common culture. And through this, even though everything might not go as planned, we will be all right. So what does this story mean in real life? Well, thankfully, you know what it means in real life. Think about what your forefathers did. What did your forefathers eat? Well, they ate fruits, vegetables, they ate meat, and they weren't fat and gross like we are. How did your forefathers marry? Well, they never divorced. They didn't have 1969 no-fault divorce laws being in place. They loved each other and didn't allow divorce to be an option. How did your forefathers make the economy successful? Well, they had farming and manufacturing. That's really it. Farming and manufacturing. We maintain the value of our currency, and we actually have a successful economy. we have a super good model of what to do. It's not like we have no clue where to start. We have a super successful model of what our forefathers did, and we just need to follow that so that we can restore what we had before. I said this video would be about what we can do as conservatives to restore what we once had. Well, earlier in the video, like I said, I referenced Jocko Willink's two sayings: discipline equals freedom and extreme ownership. Extreme ownership is what we need to do as individuals to take back our society. I said in this video that I would give some practical advice for conservatives as individuals to restore the society we once had. And I also said that we could be coming back to Jocko Willink's extreme ownership. And extreme ownership, if taken to its extreme ownership, means that you take on the responsibility of everybody, just like Jesus did. And obviously we aren't Jesus, so we can't do what Jesus did, but we can take steps to strive to be like Jesus. So the first one we can do as conservatives to take extreme ownership is to take extreme ownership of our bodies and of our lives. What does that mean? We have to get our finances in order, make sure we're financially independent. We need to get our health in order. I'm doing that right now. I'm 19 and husky, but I'm dropping that weight. I'm getting swole, But we got to get our lives in order, and that way we can actually create something better. It's Jordan Peterson's clean your room. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. You need to make sure yourself is good before you go out and criticize other people, our society, and the world. But after we do that, we know what we have to do. We have to take powerful positions in every institution. We have to get people in leadership in education, creating new education opportunities outside of our current institutions because they're so corrupt. We need to take ownership of our media so it's not as corrupt, having the same Fox News that instituted a freaking vaccine mandate. We need to take ownership of our government. We need to get young and old. We need to get all different varieties of people in positions of government so that we can institute the policies and the ideas that we know will help our society. Banning porn, making it harder to get fast food. All these things that create vice in our society and make people weaker and less strong and able to return to what our Father recommended. And I think this is really possible. If you think about it, a bunch of 20 and 30-year-olds took on the strongest military in the world in the 1770s, and they created our nation. We just need to follow their model and pursue the Father. We're obviously in much more dire straits than the problems of the 1770s, like taxes and representation that led to a revolution. But we have the tools to do that. We have the people to do that. I know tons of people that will be successful, but we need to amass as much power as possible, amass as many successful young people as possible so that we can rise to power and create a society that we know to be better than the one we are currently in. If you do that, if you fix as many things as possible, if you raise a family, if you do the things that you know to be correct, even if life doesn't work out as you planned, even if you die a martyr, we all win in the end. And that's what we asked for. So discipline yourself, submit yourself to the Father, and destroy the Antichrist. Thank you guys for watching this video. It's the end of my first 3-part series, but I'm not stopping here. Obviously, I just talked about making sure to rise to power. Obviously, we got to make the opinions. We got to learn how to articulate ourselves. Got a little bit of a cold right now. You can probably hear it. But we got to get that content rolling out. So the next video, I think it'll be about the enemy. I think it'll be about the Antichrist. I'm not sure, though. You'll see. Next Monday, 4 p.m. That's the consistent schedule. And thanks for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. All those things YouTubers say to do. I don't know if they actually help, but I assume they do. So do that stuff. And keep up with the newest face in conservatism, Jonathan Drager.